Abdelkhalek Touhami, full professor at the Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. And now, please welcome to the stage the speakers for this session. Andrew Davelin, Africa Region Chief Economist at the World Bank Group. Shahir Zaki, Chaired Professor of Economics at University of Orleans. And Tafere Tesfatshu, Senior Advisor at Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Before giving the floor to the chair for this session, we will view a short introductory video for the panel.
African policymakers faced mounting fiscal challenges in balancing limited resources and rising debt with pressing development goals. Persistent deficits, constrained revenue mobilization, and high debt service restrict the fiscal space needed for infrastructure, social services, and climate resilience. Shifts in debt profiles towards more commercial, higher costs, and short-term borrowing raise exposure to external shocks and refinancing risks. Strong fiscal rules, improved transparency, and institutional reforms are essential to enhance the credibility and flexibility of public financial management systems. Additionally, existing debt resolution frameworks must adapt to align with Africa's development and climate imperatives. Innovative financing instruments and prudent expenditure choices present potential pathways forward, but come with new risks and implementation challenges. How can countries strengthen revenue mobilization and leverage innovative financing without hampering growth or equity? What reforms can boost expenditure efficiency and protect essential services during fiscal consolidation? How should institutional frameworks and governance mechanisms evolve to enhance fiscal credibility and manage natural resources? What strategies best address debt sustainability and resolution, considering Africa's unique risks and long-term needs?
Abdelkhalek Touhami, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. You're welcome, everybody. I am Touhami Abdelkhalek. I am professor at UMICSP here at the Faculty of Governance and Sciences Economic and Social. The English is my third language. I will speak French to be more clear. Okay? Thank you. So,
I wish to thank all my colleagues from PCNS who involved me in the preparation for this session. When I was asked to serve as the moderator for this session, I looked at the thematic and saw that I needed to redo the exercises to be able to animate it because of all that's related to fiscal policy that's decreed in the first session. You saw how often the term fiscal came back in the preceding session because it's linked. As for the continent, in the first part of the session, our colleagues talked about monetary policy in general on the continent. This is so heterogeneous, especially for fiscal policies, that we cannot talk about a fiscal policy for the continent. Only look country by country, how much heterogeneity, and we can't talk about one single policy. Another point for fiscal policy, when we look at the weight of informal sector in the country, we can see what could be fiscal policy in a context where the informal sector is very large, and the challenges the governments are facing. When we look in order how the problems are posed, there's public receipts that are weak. All colleagues talked about budget space by the government. The consequence is that due to the expenses, the deficit is added and the debt grows. So the more the debt grows, the more space is reduced. And so the arbitration to finance infrastructure in a large sense, education, sovereignty, etc., is a real issue for governments. And on the other hand, next to the problem of financing, social charge and population expectations are always growing at various levels. Second major question. The maneuver margin for those governments, even if sometimes they have access to resources, natural or other resources, and so the question, the equation for most governments is how to mobilize more resources, how to manage expenses, and how to face social pressure and their consequences for debt. I won't say more because this will be the goal of this session. We are lucky to have with us various profiles. Mr. Andrew Dabalin, who will talk on about fiscal issues and mobilizing internal resources. We have Mr. Tafere Tesfatshu, I hope I pronounced your name well, who will talk about debt, and our friend Shahir Zaki, who will talk about perspectives, especially if the government has access to rare resources, minerals, natural resources, etc., in this market. Everything that's happening in the US or elsewhere for rare resources. The idea is to solve all those questions. Now I will go one way or another to see, starting with you, Professor, asking you, I will ask you, how do you address debt?
Some regions or by country, it's yours to see exactly how can we raise that debt in our continent. This is the question for you, and after that I will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator. Since we don't have much time, very quickly, let me start by linking our discussion here with a major international conference that ended about 10 days ago in Seville, Spain, the fourth international conference on financing for development, addressing issues that are directly relevant for our discussion in this session. I wanted to mention this conference because African group went there well prepared and actively engaged to seeking some consensus from the international community on various issues, but most specifically the combating illicit financial flows and debt restructuring, especially on debt. They are looking for long-term solution to that issue. Now, the outcome document, which is called Compromiso de Sevilla, didn't live up to expectation and a level of ambition, which is not really surprising given the current global political environment. For example, the US was not present in Seville. In fact, they withdrew from the negotiations early on in New York, objecting to the word sustainable and sustainable development goals being used in the document, so they were not there. And EU and UK were not really in the mood to discuss about ODA and additional finances for development. Nevertheless, there was a consensus, and a number of issues came out of this conference that African countries wanted to see. Now, I don't want to go through the list, but let me highlight a couple of them since they are relevant to our discussion on debt. First of all, they wanted the debt swap arrangement to be strengthened. The World Bank will be coordinating, and they want their swap to remain and as a solution to their debt problem. And secondly, they wanted the G20 common framework for debt treatments to be strengthened. This was introduced in 2020. And actually now the burden falls on South Africa because the next summit, G20, will be in South Africa. So they have to build on this momentum and see how the framework could be used to help African countries. African countries also wanted an Africa credit rating agency to be established, and this was also endorsed. This was because of their frustration and disappointment with existing credit rating agencies, the global ones, the three big ones, Moody, S&P, and Fitch, and the methodologies they use for rating countries, which has impact on the interest rate they pay on their debt, plus also on investment flows, and that was also endorsed. And also, very importantly, the operationalization of the African Financing Stability Mechanism, which Africa Union jointly with Africa Development Bank launched, I think, in 2022, and that also was endorsed. It will be strengthened, and we can say a couple of things how it could be strengthened, because at the moment, I think the idea is to create a fund for debt financing through concessional loans, including IMF type of conditionalities about reform and so on. Now, this is like a backdrop for me to the discussion. Now, what I want to say is the following, maybe 2 points, if I have time, 3 points. The first point is to say that I think if African countries are looking for long-term solutions, if the objective is to find a long-term solution, both African countries and their development partners, in my view, should stop treating debt crisis, persistent and continuous debt crisis, as fiscal crisis or fiscal emergencies only. But instead, I think they should treat it as developmental crisis, deeper development crisis, as a reflection or result of chronic underinvestment in productive capacity building. It's economic mismanagement, and especially how the borrowed money is used. Very important. It's a failure of, I think, African countries to mobilize adequate domestic resources, which Andrew is going to talk about. It's a failure of African countries, I think, to achieve, I would say, sustained and meaningful growth. There's growth and there's growth. Meaningful growth that generates decent jobs, growth that helps them to diversify from dependence on commodity production and exports. 38 countries out of 54 in Africa, their export for 60% of it is on raw material, commodity, very little value addition. So how to diversify? And also generate income, savings. That's the way they will be able to pay. So if the intention is long-term solution, I think they have to go beyond debt relief, debt suspension, even debt cancellation, and see the debt crisis what it is, which is very developmental and structural in nature. This is one point I would highlight. The second point is that African debt problem is not the size. Actually, compared to other regions, countries, African debt is small. I mean, if you look at the share of debt to GDP, only 23 countries in Africa have this share above 60%. Compared to G7 countries, is 100%, some of them 170% of their GDP, they have external debt. So Africa, in that respect, is not really much. What's the problem now is the cost of servicing the debt. And this is because the profile of African debt has shifted the last 13 to 15 years. And let me highlight very quickly how. First of all, in the last 13 years or so, China has emerged as the main bilateral creditor of African countries. Actually, China, the share now in Africa total trade is increased from about 4% in about 13 years ago now to 8%. It's about $65 billion. Now, in contrast, the share of Paris Club members, as you know, traditionally the main providers of concessional loans, has sharply declined in the last 13 years, from about 28% to down to 6%. Only 48 billion of it is now owed to this group of countries. Now, with reduction in concessional loans, African countries are forced to rely on private lenders. So over the last 13 years now, private lenders have emerged as the main creditors of African countries. In fact, their share has gone from about 12% some 13 years ago, now 25%, which accounts for about $186 billion. Now, what does it mean? It means that with the increase in private lenders, and because they regard African countries risky, they are asking higher interest rate. So now the interest rate paid by African countries is high. In fact, the average in the last 3-4 years between 2022 2004, average has reached 9.8%, which is about 8-9 times more than what, for example, Germany would pay. If Germany is borrowing now international market, they pay 1%. US 2.5%. Even Latin American countries, the average is about 6 to 8%. So therefore, the main drain now is not just the debt, but the servicing of that debt has become a main drain. Now, so much so, now the majority of African countries, they spend around 15% of their export earnings servicing debt. You may have seen these figures that most of them pay more servicing debt than they spend on education and health. In fact, in per capita terms, African countries spend $70 servicing debt, while they spend only about 63 on health, or 44 on 63 on education, 44 on health. Now, this is a drain of resources that we're talking about. So if we're looking for long-term solutions, I'm looking at the time, I'm aware. Looking for long-term solutions, I think we should go beyond the short-term fix of debt relief, debt suspension, address the fundamental development problems. Now here I will focus on building productive capacity, very, very important. So there is now increased recognition of what I'm just talking about, because the World Bank and IMF just started what they call debt for development swap, which is in the right direction, which means that expensive debt will be exchanged for cheaper debt, and the savings will be used on development purposes, which you may address. I think this is the direction it should go. The Africa financing stability mechanism should also go, I think, in that direction. Concessional loans alone is not enough. I think any debt financing should focus on development. For the moment, let me stop here, and then I'll come back if need be. Thank you.
Thank you. So now, if we want to avoid the debt, we have to mobilize the domestic resource. We have to look what can we do to improve, to increase the saving in the countries. How can we do that, Professor Andrew?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here again. It's always a stimulating environment for these kinds of deep, big strategic issues in Africa. So just to build on what my colleague, panelists just said, I think we have to accept that the world that we've known, in which African countries have kind of relied on to finance themselves, is changing very rapidly, right? Aid architecture is changing, probably will not come back. There's a lot of trade uncertainty. And if there's trade fragmentation, that probably diminishes how much you can rely on trade for increasing your revenues. China is slowing down in its lending to Africa. Financial markets have been closed for a while. They remain closed, and if they're open, they're very expensive. And then, of course, there's debt, and there is the international financial institutions like the one I work in, who don't have the muscle, the financial muscle, to meet all the needs Okay? However much they try, they don't have all the financial muscle to meet all the needs that these countries need. So where does that leave us? That leaves basically reliance on own resources for these countries. But here's where African countries find themselves between a rock and a hard place, right? African citizens are not in a mood at all for increases in taxes. I think maybe many of you are aware that, in fact, there have been lots of protests. I mean, in my own country, Kenya, there have been protests last year, specifically triggered by a particular finance bill, which sought to raise taxes as part of domestic resource mobilization. And that anniversary was celebrated recently in June. And who knows, next year whether it will recur again and again and again. So, as a result of that, the Kenyan government has sort of kind of abandoned the whole idea of increasing taxes. But what's a government supposed to do, given this context? I don't think there is any way you can escape collecting more revenues domestically. All these countries are going to have to rely on their own resources to develop. You can't rely on, developing your country from outside sources forever, right? So there are three pillars of what a fiscal policy is supposed to be. One is obviously tax revenues, domestic resources from taxes. The other one is how you actually allocate that and the efficiency with which you allocate spending. And the third is debt. Okay? Debt is part of a fiscal policy, right? If there is a gap, then you can go and borrow. Each one of these is facing real challenges. But let me say that I'm going to focus on how African governments can still increase tax revenues. You don't have to raise tax rates, okay? It's not necessary to increase tax rates. Now, there is always a big debate in economics about what is an optimal tax that promotes growth, ensures equity, and still is efficient, okay, and raises enough revenues. There's no, I don't think there is a magic number there, but it's anywhere between what? I don't know, 15 to 20%, 11 to 20%. There's a wide margin. But beyond that, of course, you have to think about how you allocate that, where you spend that money on. But the things that African countries can do is, one, improve the administration. Tax administration is still a tool available to a lot of these African countries without increasing tax rates, right? So this means basically you have to think about improving the capacity to actually register taxpayers, improve the ability to, and the capacity to detect how much taxes should be paid, who should pay them, and improve the capacity to collect those taxes, right? Without necessarily increasing tax rates, right? So that means you have to think about how to deploy staff, personnel, give them the right incentives, manage them properly, right? Give them real tax allocations that is meaningful, and so on and so on. Now that, of course, involves a lot of political climate. What we find in the literature is the following. When you think about compliance, which is basically to pull in a lot of people to pay taxes, right? There's a lot of instruments that are available out there, and all of them give you roughly the same, effect sizes, meaning the same amount of returns in terms of number of people you can pull into the tax rates. So in the extensive margin, which is about compliance, you have lots of instruments to use. But on the intensive margin, what of these interventions will give you really the greatest collection of taxes? There are three. One of them is, of course, enforcement, okay? And that you need people. Deploying of tax officials, and detection via third-party information. These will be like employers providing the wage, financial sector providing the kinds of assets that people hold, and so on and so on. Now, technology can help in all these places, but it is not by any means a panacea, right? So, there have been a lot of discussions about how to digitalize all these tax, but you can't really replace people. I mean, you still need people who can use these technologies to be able to detect, to be able to register, to be able to collect, and so on and so on. So having said that, so that's tax administration. Now, there is one area where, in fact, tax increases are popular. And that is wealth taxes. It's really hard to do wealth taxes. It's very easy to hide wealth, especially if it is in financial assets and so on and so on. But there's one area where it's very difficult to hide, and that's property. Okay? So property taxes can be a real source of revenue, but it will increase progressivity, and it is also actually efficient and equitable. The property taxes are all the favorable things, all the desirable things we think about optimal taxes, right? You can't hide them. They're very efficient, and they allow efficient allocation. They are equitable because they are by nature progressive, right? And you can collect a lot of revenues because, especially with the growing population, there will be a lot of increases in property, in housing stock, and so on, right? So that's one area. The other one is corporate taxes, especially for multinational corporations. That's also very popular, and it's not going to be controversial. The third area is resource rents, okay? Shahir is going to talk about resource rents, but especially in resource rents, there is scope for, first of all, collecting what is owed, which in most cases is not collected, and third, you could potentially get more because resource rents in Africa are some of the lowest. They're about 40% on average. The global average is about 80%, okay? So Africans collect basically half of what, on average, people should be collecting. They should be collecting. So that's on the tax administration. The final, the second to last area I was going to say is it's really how you spend these resources that you collect. Okay? And here, the key thing is really to try and be very radical in transparency in spending. Okay, first you have to think about how to allocate. Composition of allocation of spending is important, but also the transparency in terms of procurement, in terms of the quality of public investment management, that is really important. Fighting corruption, preventing it, and then punishing, corrupt practices, right? So that is the other area where African governments can really improve, because we often think about, okay, you collect taxes, you spend, but spending really well, transparently, is a form of resource mobilization because it actually increases efficiency in allocation. Finally, I would say African countries need to grow. There is no way, however much you want to tax, there's no way you'll have any chance of mobilizing enough revenues to meet all the needs of a society if you cannot grow. Growth gives you a lot of leeway in terms of increasing the assets that are available for taxation, because new companies get in, new products are introduced, new markets are created, and so on. And so all those are sources of revenue, but also it increases the value of existing assets, okay? That's the value of growth, right? So that's why it's so important to think about growth as really a part of fiscal policy. Now, growth, of course, is endogenous, as is fiscal policy, right? So you have to think about both fiscal and spending, which is fiscal policy, plus debt structures that do not damage your growth prospects in the long term, and therefore allow you for structural transformation. So that's where I want to stop, and I'm happy to have a conversation after that.
Thank you, dear Andrew. Thank you very much. Thank you for the roadmap, how we have to manage in fiscal policy. Now, عندي أسئلة لشهير. يمكن أسأله بالعربية. Non, je vais te poser les questions en français, Shahir.
Going to ask you in French. When we are looking at the natural resources in Africa, mineral resources, there are opportunities. How can we connect fiscal problems with these opportunities if we are able to do so? Thank you, Tuhami. I'm going to answer in English because the session is in English.
Slides, I don't know if we can, they are shared. Yes, thank you. So I will build on what my panelist fellows has mentioned in terms of the global view of the debt and what is the fiscal perspective of the reforms in terms of the revenues, how to better collect the revenues and how to better spend, as Andrew mentioned, and I will also touch upon that. So basically what I want to see, if we want to analyze that in Africa in such challenging times, what are the future opportunities that we can have and whether they are missed so far, because so far they are a bit missed, and how really to avoid missing them even in the future. So to do that, I'll just go through 3 quick ideas why those times are really challenging for Africa, and this was presented by my panelists. My fellow panelists, and then what are the future or missed opportunities, and perhaps at the end, what are the actionable recommendations that should be taken into consideration. Clearly, if we look at the figures for the debt in Africa, we can see that the global public debt, as you can see, has been increasing exponentially until it reached $102 trillion US dollar in 2024. If we look at the public debt as a share to GDP, the trend is increasing everywhere. Africa is not an exception, but as you correctly mentioned, it's not the level that matters, but more the share of debt and what is the reason behind being indebted and how we're going to finance this debt. Because if it's costly, this means that everything will be affected. Even worse, if we look at some specific figures, and this was also, you mentioned this, that we experience some structural changes in debt in Africa. So for instance, if we look in 2024, the number of developing countries with public debt above 60%, the highest is in Africa, 23 countries in Africa, much less in Asia and Latin America. The number of developing countries spending more than 5% of their exports on external public debt service, again, it's almost double in Africa than in Asia and Latin America. The average bond yield is almost double the other regions, so it's almost 10% in Africa, while it's 5% in Asia and 7% in Latin America. And also, the number of private creditors has been increasing in Africa, and this explains why the yield has the bond yields have been increasing, because basically private creditors, they perceive that Africa is riskier, so we have to get a higher interest rate. So this means that the way out, we always perceive the debt problem as a financial problem, which is, in economics term, it's necessary but not sufficient. And that's why even if we look at the recent document that was published by the United Nations with the expert group that tried to develop some concrete actions in order to unlock sustainable financing and address the debt problem. If we look at those recommendations, 5 recommendations are about the multilateral reforms and from a financial perspective. Then 3 reforms about the cooperation between countries, and 3 reforms about the national measures to be implemented. And actually, none of those recommendations touched upon the real sector itself, in the sense that all the recommendations were really around how to reform the financial sector at either the multilateral, the national, or the regional level. But the root cause of the debt itself was not really addressed. So that's why in the second part, I just want to touch upon those future opportunities that can address the debt problem, but from a the real sector perspective. And to do that, I will focus on 3 main issues: reforms in crisis times, the AFCFTA, because I think that it can really have a very important role in addressing the real sector and therefore mobilize more resources to address the debt problem, and critical minerals in Africa. In terms of the reforms in crisis times, I totally agree with Andrew, as he said, that at the end of the day, what matters also is the way I spend the money I collect. And I think there is a structural problem in Africa in the sense that there is a distortion between current versus productive spending. So if we look at the structure of public spending in Africa, not less than between 50 and 70%, or even it can go up to 90% in some countries, that are allocated to current spending. And by current spending, I mean wages of public officials, interest payments, subsidies, and other short-term spending, with a very small fraction, between 10 and 20%, that goes to either physical or human capital investment, health, education, and infrastructure. And this, again, goes to feeds in the same problem, in the sense that most of the spending targets the short term, with much less spending aiming the long term, and consequently growth. So I think that, and it was proven in the literature in several studies, that it's very important to address this distortion between productive versus non-productive spending, in order to have a long-term growth. And that's why, if we look at even the share of fiscal of African countries that have a fiscal discipline or adopt fiscal rules, they are mainly concentrated. In general, they are very few. That's the general rule in Africa. And very few countries, they have some fiscal rules in Western Africa. But other than this, no other country really have either revenues rule, spending rule, debt rule, and so on. And that's why I think it's very important, first, to address how we prioritize public spending and on what do we spend, and second, to what extent this spending will be disciplined through a clear and credible rule. From a real sector perspective as well, I think, and this was proven in the literature, that the FCFTA has to be ambitious. If it's not ambitious, it will fail. And so far we have seen that we can claim that's a relative failure, because it started implementation in January 2021. So far, the number of transactions that are traded under the FCFTA is very small, almost negligible. And this is mainly because I think due to two main reasons. The first one is the weak connectivity that we have in Africa. And just before coming here, we were discussing with my colleagues in the bus that moving between African countries is much more costly than going from Africa to Europe. And that's why we have to go in, I mean, if I'm traveling from Egypt to Tanzania, I have first go to Doha or to Istanbul, then go to Tanzania or even Ethiopia. And that's why this can just illustrate to what extent trade cost is really high. And this is a perfect translation of what's going on in terms of trade in goods and trade in services in Africa. And I think this leads also to the second problem, which is the problem of the behind-the-border barriers and non-tariff measures, because so far they are very costly. And that's why if the FCFTA focuses just on tariff removal, it will be just a general replication of the existing regional economic communities, which will add a further layer of complexity to trade in Africa. So that's why trade facilitation will be a key, for exports, for imports, for value chains. For exports, because in recent paper we showed that a one-day custom delay is almost 1% tariff equivalent of imports 1 day. So if we multiply by the number of days the product will wait in the customs, and on average in Africa it's between 10 and 20 days. So we're just talking about between 10 and 20% of the value of imports as an increase, as if we are imposing an extra tariff of 10 to 20%, which is very high. And clearly, given that African countries, they import a lot of intermediate inputs like capital goods that are used in the production process itself, this will clearly affect the competitiveness of exports themselves, which will weaken exports and therefore will weaken the foreign currency coming from exports, which can help them address the problem of debt. So that's why trade facilitation is key for exports, it's key for imports. As I said, given that African countries, they import a lot of intermediate goods that are used in exports. And it's key also for tax collection, because the literature also showed to what extent trade facilitation has a positive effect on non-resource tax revenues that come from, and the collection of customs duties in general. So for AFCFTA, it's very important to address this issue of trade facilitation. One final point is on critical minerals. And as you can see on this map that was developed by the Bureau Régional pour la Géologie Minière in France, which is our partner in the chair in Orléans. And here you can see to what extent Africa is rich in critical minerals. And clearly all those critical minerals, we have copper and nickel in Botswana, cobalt, copper and cobalt, phosphate in Morocco, aluminium in Mozambique, copper and cobalt in Zambia, and so on. And the list is very long. And clearly all those minerals are highly needed for both the digital and the energy transition, which means that at the world level, the demand is very high. But at the same time, if this wealth of Africa is not really addressed in a new way compared to the way that oil was addressed, we will have a new resource curse. And it was also shown in the literature to what extent this resource curse is mainly an institutional curse in the sense that it's because of bad governance of natural resources. At the end of the day, all the revenues coming from those resources, and as you said, they are not really channeled through the formal channels of the government, and that's why it affects its revenues and therefore its indebtedness. So that's why, to conclude, 3 key quick recommendations for the AFCFTA. The key recommendation would be trade facilitation, and that's why investment in intra-African connectivity and infrastructure is key. Addressing non-tariff measures will also be important to better enforce the AFCFTA. The domestic reforms mainly would be about how to reprioritize current versus productive spending and the adoption of fiscal rules and more fiscal discipline. And for critical minerals, more better governance and public engagement to avoid a new institutional curse that is going to affect public debt. So I think that those 3 points will address the debt problem, but from a real sector perspective, not just from the financial sector perspective, which can again address some long-term objectives that go beyond the strict problem of debt. And I will stop here. Thank you to him.
Merci. Merci, Shahir. Thank you, all of you, for your insight on the session proposed. Now, we have maybe 20 minutes to questions. Donc, on va ouvrir le débat.
We are going to open the Q&A. Faisal raised his hand. We have a question. Then Andy. No, you already took the floor.
Framer from SOAS in the University of London. I greatly enjoyed all of those presentations, and I just wanted to ask the panelists if you might expand a bit more on the bridge from Tesfatshu's extremely important point about a debt crisis is really a productive crisis, right? Between that and fiscal policy. It's one thing, and it's a very good thing, to talk about property taxes. It's important, it's realistic, but probably it's more realistic, and there's more buy-in, if it's tied to a productive strategy. And just to give you one example, is in Mauritius, where there was a sugar tax that was imposed as a kind of functional substitute for a property tax on landed elites in Mauritius. And the intriguing thing about that was the way in which the revenue was earmarked to be plowed into infrastructure, into marketing, and into innovation and sugar-related R&D. So in a way, the question is, have you got other good examples like that? Do you think it's realistic? How high a priority to tie those taxes to a productive strategy? Thank you.
Thank you. Andy, please. Ici au centre.
Okay, thank you very much. Agree with what Chris has just said, but I just wanted to ask a specific question.
Sorry, Andy, can you present yourself, please?
Oh, sorry. Andy McKay, University of Sussex, UK. I'd just like to ask a specific question about property taxes. in a lot of countries, and Kenya is a prime example of that, the citizens don't want any taxes at all. It doesn't matter what's taxed. They've lost complete confidence in the government and how it uses its money. Do you think property taxes are going to be any more popular than any other tax? Yes, they've got good equity and efficiency properties, but how popular are they going to be? And secondly, how practical are they to implement in terms of identifying the property, identifying the owners, rates of taxation and so on? And how much revenue do you really think can be raised for property taxes relative to what you might think are the needs?
Merci. Ici, devant.
Merci, Nourdine El-Kad.
Thank you, Nourdine Kaddouri. Mohammed V University, my first question, Mr. Shakir. You've talked about rare minerals, the dependence on exports. Wouldn't it impact industrial sectors' growth and fiscal revenues? My second question is about the fiscal issue. When we are in the protectionism, automatically we implement taxes. Mr. Representative of the World Bank gave us the way of doing things, but my question is in this warfare that we are living in, how can we face them?
Pour ceux qui ont déjà eu la parole, je m'excuse, je reviens.
Another question. Good evening. Thank you for all the speakers, to all the speakers.
Mr. Tefere, if I pronounced it well. So I think you talk about the credit rating agency, specifically for Africa. So I wanted to know if African countries were able to get that kind of agency, what will be the credibility of that kind of institution in the African context. And the second question that I have, I think other speakers talked a lot about the allocation of the fiscal revenue. And I think one sentence that came out of the speech was that if we have more development, we can have more tax revenue. I don't know if the direction of going is exactly the one we should be looking at. Because if we do not manage our fiscal resources very well, I don't think the development that we are aiming for will ever come. So I think it's more about looking at how we manage the debt, not only the allocation, but also the issue of corruption. I think none of you haven't mentioned it, and I think for me that will be a main issue to talk about when we talk about fiscal policy.
Thank you. On va avoir une deuxième vague after that. So I will ask you to answer. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will answer some of the questions. I will leave the others to colleagues here. Actually, Chris, you really articulated what I'm trying to say even better by giving the Mauritius example. A lot of the debt swap or debt mechanism that we've seen starting from HIPC and then the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative and various other initiatives to reduce debt, have focused on 2-3 things. One, either refinancing debt on conditions that countries follow IMF type of conditionality, macroeconomic reforms, and so on, or suspending debt payment or debt cancellation. And all of these are short-term fixes. And what I was trying to say is that we have to convert this into development focus swap, so to speak. The debt swap releases finances that countries can use to finance some of their expenditures domestically, but they are not being used for development of product capacity. That's what the point I'm trying to make. The product capacity, I'm hammering on it because it's really critical. This is what enables countries to produce a wide range of goods and services that they can either consume domestically or export competitively. At the end of the day, that's what development is about. So if countries do not develop their product capacity, they will not be able to diversify. They will not be able to generate or create jobs that pay higher. They will not be able to add value. They will not be able to conduct technological learning. That is the bottom line. So if countries are being helped with debt, exchanging expensive debt for cheaper ones and releasing resources for investment domestically, I think it's very important as part of that conditionality. It should be spending it, as you said, with Mauritius, the tax being spent on infrastructure. And because, you see, debt by itself is not the problem. Debt is actually a very effective tool for development. The problem is, what are you doing with the money you're borrowing? That's at the end of the day. If you are not spending it such a way that it generates income and savings so that you'll be able to pay either interest rate or your debt, then you are permanently, like what's happening in Africa, consistently in debt crisis. That is a problem. Debt is not the problem. It's what you're doing with the resources. On the rating agency I mentioned, there has been a lot of frustration by African countries with the global rating agency, as I said, the big three. And they use credit assessment as a criteria. And what the rate they give you is very important. Private bond holders decide how much interest rate they'll ask depending on the rating. And also even investment flows, sometimes influenced by that. So African countries have been really frustrated. So what they've asked in this Financing for Development conference is to set up their own rating agency in Africa. And this has been approved. It was not easy. They had to negotiate. Now we'll see how to operationalize it and how it will work. I hope they will make it work. On how the tax issue, by the way, I agree with Andrew that at the end of the day, domestic resource mobilization is absolutely critical. That's what gives you the fiscal space. You need to spend on development and industrialization. The average in African countries in terms of the revenue to GDP is around 16%, much lower. In fact, it ranges between Ethiopia, 7.5%, like Nigeria, about 7%, to countries like Mauritius and so on, about 23 or so, compared to the average 26% as the developing countries, and over 30%, of course, 35% in developed countries. So domestic resource mobilization is critical. It's not easy, as Andrew was explaining, but it's absolutely critical. And one way you do it is by looking at illicit financial flows. This is really critical. There are figures now floating around, apparently between 2013 and 2023, on average, annually, $90 billion is leakage, goes from Africa, $90 billion. Now, it's not just corrupt bureaucrats putting the money somewhere abroad. Most of it is actually manipulation of transfer pricing. The multinational corporation is not paying taxes, aggressive tax evasion. These are the sort of things that can be corrected. At the end, African countries with debt issues are faced with three choices. One is to continue accumulating debt, unsustainable debt, and go the possibility of defaulting and increasing their riskiness, or implement fiscal consolidation, which basically means focusing on expenditure cutting, which means development projects will be cut, infrastructure and so on, slowing down growth, and then you're back on the trap. Or third, increase tax in an environment of low tax base, and then first Kenya type of social unrest. These are the trap that African countries are. So in seeking solution for debt, that's my point and my message, that they should really start treating debt not just simply as a fiscal issue, which is as well fiscal, but very much a developmental and structural problem, and addressing it from that angle. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. I think I will address two main points. The first point on this, how to bridge this, the fiscal part with the real part, and how tied the taxes to the productive part. I think at the end of the day it will be, and I think it will also address part of the question by Andy on the confidence of people and how popular are taxes. I think at the end of the day, for both points or for both dimensions, it's a matter of credibility and institutions. So that's why as long as the rules are clear and how those revenues are collected and where they are channeled, this can be a bit, this can enhance the credibility of the government in collecting taxes, and therefore will reduce the fiscal deficit and therefore reduce the accumulation of debt. But clearly, so far, this credibility is almost absent in almost all the African countries, to the extent that I remember in some African countries there were some reforms related to the tax collection from SMEs, and when those that were working in the SME sector, they went to the Ministry of Finance in order to regularize their situation, they found that the proposed reform, I mean all the exemptions that they were promised, they were not really enforceable. So that's why all this affects the credibility and therefore how people perceive those taxes. And this is related also to the point of corruption that you said, which is will be key, and that's what I meant in the part of the critical minerals by the institutional curse of mineral resources, in the sense that if mineral resources, I mean the literature says that most of the countries that have mineral resources, it was more a curse than a blessing, but it's not the curse itself, it's because of the bad governance and the bad institutions, which is basically corruption, that these countries have. One final point, concernant la dépendance des minéraux et le mal...
About dependency on minerals and the Dutch issue, it depends mostly on governance and on how money that comes from exportations is used in the industrial circuit in order to add value to raw products, because 60% of our exportations today are raw materials. So those receipts are then not reinvested in the manufacturing sector, given that the majority of IDEs in this sector either in the primary sector like agriculture or mining industries, or in sectors like construction. Those are sectors with low added value and low technology transfer. So all this affects the domestic value chain and dependency of African countries on raw materials and minerals. So this is mostly an issue of knowing if governments guarantees that their receipts are reinvested in the productive apparatus of those countries, and how They attract ideas into other sectors. Thank you. Très rapidement, je suis d'accord avec vous, Chris. Je crois qu'une crise est un problème, une crise de dette est un problème de structure avant tout. Et quelle est la crédibilité de relier des impôts plus élevés? Cela dépend de l'élément le plus important qui est comment les gouvernements et la société mettent en œuvre leur compact social. Je crois que c'est très important de ne pas mal interpréter les manifestations. Le message de ces manifestations n'est pas que les gens ne veulent pas payer l'impôt. Les gens veulent payer, veulent voir dans quoi leurs impôts seront investis, dans quel genre de services sont livrés avec les impôts que nous payons. C'est ça l'insatisfaction, le décalage entre les impôts payés et les services livrés. C'est une occasion pour les élites africaines de commencer la transition vers un véritable contrat social avec les citoyens. C'est là qu'est la véritable lutte. Si l'élite africaine veut rester au pouvoir, veut réussir, c'est le problème auquel ils doivent commencer à travailler. Je ne demandais pas une augmentation d'impôts, mais plutôt un meilleur investissement dans l'administration. Et maintenant, sur ce, nous avons effectué une étude en ligne, examiner les propriétés urbaines, etc., où la plupart des activités de production ont lieu. Et pour l'instant, en moyenne, les pays africains récoltent environ 0,3% de leur PIB en taxes fiscales. Si chaque pays récolte environ 3%, si les pays africains passaient à 3% de PIB, ils peuvent récolter 60 milliards de dollars, 13 milliards, même si c'est seulement la moitié, c'est un quart, c'est 13 milliards. J'ai regardé les chiffres dans ce que nous avons dit dans ce rapport avant de venir. Il y a quelque chose de bien plus fondamental par rapport aux impôts fiscaux. Ces pays dépendent trop des taxes commerciales, des taxes indirectes, des impôts indirects. Nous devons commencer une transition pour nous éloigner de tout cela. Tout cela renforce l'État administratif. Il y a beaucoup de choses à faire afin de pouvoir récolter des taxes fiscales correctement. Il faut enregistrer les terres, il faut faire le cadastre, il faut savoir qu'est-ce qui appartient à quoi. Tout ça. Mais c'est ce dont il s'agit pour une bonne gestion d'État. Il faut investir dans ces choses, on ne peut pas toujours le repousser. C'est pourquoi je crois que les taxes de propriété sont si importantes. Donc, quel est le degré de réalisme de tout cela? Je dirais seulement qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup d'autres options. Ensuite, ce que j'ai dit précédemment, le contrat social, il faut manifester en tant que décideur politique, en tant qu'élite politique, que nous allons employer ces ressources d'une manière prudente et transparente. Nous avons vu des exemples de pays qui, lorsqu'ils ont, ou même de petites juridictions, qui, lorsqu'ils le font, les gens sont prêts à payer leurs impôts. Merci.
Je crois qu'il y a de l'espace pour prendre 3 ou 4 autres questions et on va les ménager. Il y a une main ici, une main là-bas et puis Mahmoud là-bas. Après, je tourne d'abord ce côté. Non, devant, ici.
Okay, good. My name is David Luke. I'm from the London School of Economics. I agree with Andrew that there isn't a whole lot of options. But let me put one option on the table and get the panel's comment on this. And that is carbon markets as a source of non-debt creating financial flows. We all know that there are all sorts of difficulties with carbon markets. What Africa does has the carbon resources, the Congo Basin, mangrove forests, mangrove swamps, you name it, it's all dotted across the continent. We know that carbon markets don't work well, but just your thoughts on how Africa can leverage this resource as another source of non-debt flows. Then the second point, broadly, let me just also preface the second point by saying that I've really appreciated how the discussion has also focused on connecting the real economy to the financial crisis, because I think you're all right that you also need to look at the real economy. And I was especially very pleased to see the emphasis that was placed on the AfCFTA as well as a source of growth dynamism on the continent. And I think we all share the disappointment that the momentum behind the AfCFTA has been somewhat lost. But I think there are some reasons for this. One is that the AfCFTA came into stream, as was said, in 2021, around the time that the countries were coming out of COVID, and I think that was one effect. The debt crisis itself, I think, has taken the attention of policymakers. But this is not to say that the benefits, and it's very rare for economic modeling using different techniques, all to arrive at the same conclusion that if this agreement is successfully implemented, including tackling the NTBs, it could be a game changer. And I've seen other working on other things which seem to suggest that if African countries are to get to double-digit growth, which is where they need to get to in order to have any hope of anything like economic transformation, double-digit growth over a period of time, then you do need to open up inter-African trade. But just to get some more thoughts on what could be done now to overcome this loss of momentum behind the AfCFTA, and just some views on this, along with the point I made about the potential of carbon markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you can make it brief and precise, it can help, please. Yes.
Thank you. Good evening. Adam Al-Harika, Director of United Nations Economic Commission for Africa's Office for North Africa. I agree with a lot of what has been said about fiscal policy and revenue mobilization within Africa. I just want to add a few points. I think it is true that fiscal policy issues are largely governance issues. The quality of institutions matters, and also capacity issues. 6 years ago, we at ECA published a study on fiscal policy and the financing of SDGs in Africa. In that study, we found out that African countries on average have the potential to increase tax revenue by 12%. But they need really to have the political commitment to do that. I will just mention a few of these areas very quickly. One of them is the quality and nature of tax policy. Withholding tax alone, some countries do not practice this, but if they do tax withholding, they can increase tax revenue by 2%. Stamp duties, I have examples from Kenya and others. Kenya's average is close to 2% of GDP. Africa's average is 0.5% of GDP. There is a lot of potential data. Then taxing state-owned enterprises is a big story. If state-owned enterprises make up 20 to 25% of GDP and they are not taxed, so this is a waste. Then natural resource, a lot of things to say, but also tax expenditure is an area, tax expenditure or tax exemptions is an area of a lot of losses. And finally, I think issues of tax transparency and accountability are very important in Africa. Thank you.
Mahmoud. Mahmoud, 1 minute.
Thank you. Mahmoud Arbouch, PCNS and UM6P. My question is addressed to Dr. Andrew. I appreciate your point on the growing out of debt perspective, which means the best way to deal with debt distress is ensuring that growth is still here. It means increasing the denominator to bring the debt to GDP ratio down. But if we look to the reality of a number of African countries, mainly low-income countries, these countries still lack basic infrastructure, basic prerequisites for growth, types of investments that require public sector participation. So it's like we're talking about the chicken and the egg paradox. How can we increase growth and while we are at high debt level? Thank you.
Thank you, Eric Bergloff, Chief Economist, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. A very stimulating panel. I just wanted to ask a question around, the property taxes also have this big advantage of all the things that you said you need to do to get effective property prices also can help financial development. And, you get more collateral and so on. So, and that is the dimension that we haven't really explored in this panel is, we say that it's very limited what you can do on other taxes or taxes in general. It's difficult to mobilize private savings or private capital. What can we do through the financial sector? And also, how can we use the financial sector possibly to address some of those capital flight that was mentioned? So just trying to get a better handle on where are we in terms of really getting the financial system to help us with domestic resource mobilization.
Thank you. Here.
Thank you very much. Mohamed Ali Emani, Faculty of Governance, UM6P. I wanted to raise a question about the fiscal multipliers and the trade-off between increasing the primary balance without hindering sustainable growth. You've highlighted the property taxes as being a great alternative by moving to the 3% threshold, but I think that there has been a consensus on the literature that they are pretty distortionary tax, especially from demand side perspective. So isn't there any less distortive alternative to the consumption incentives?
Last question, please. Here.
Thank you. I am Mohamed El-Kanzili, professor of Faculty of Economy, Shuaib Dukkali Al-Jadida. We know that in African countries there is a strong presence of the informal economic and often stigmatized. My question is for Andrew. How could African states better structure and the political this informal economy to address tax income issues?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know there is many other hands from there. I have 4 minutes only, and I have the panelists to answer. I'm sorry. Oh, no.
Okay. All right. So the last question is the most difficult one. Which is how do you structure African economies to get out of what I call micro-enterprise trap, right? And I think, this is basically a question about the nature of growth and the issues around farm formation in Africa. And it's going to be a very involved answer, but I won't go there, and be happy to have that conversation with you after this session. But I think the key thing here is really how we, so there are 3 things. on how to really change the nature of informality in Africa, right? One is we need to stop spending a lot of money supporting these tiny micro enterprises, assuming that they're going to actually grow. We know that they haven't for the last 60 years. Okay? So it's like what Einstein said, which is the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing, expecting a different outcome. I think we really need to start thinking about identifying high growth farms, whatever their size, identify those farms, invest in them, make sure that we connect them to markets, because that's going to be key, right? And to clusters, economic and production clusters. That's where the issues around the way in which markets, access to markets for farmers is very important, that FCFTA can do that. A lot of African countries are tiny markets. So, they need to integrate in order to be able to create incentives for farms to grow larger and so on. So that's the first.
Please look at the chronometer also, okay?
Okay, I'm keeping track of the clock. On property taxes, I totally agree. I think this is an additional reason why you want to do property taxes, because it's actually a way to develop your capital markets and financial markets, right? And that also allows you to borrow domestically on local currency, and therefore avoid all the problems that come from this original scene of actually borrowing in foreign currency. Excessively borrowing from foreign currency. So totally agree with that. I think there is a question about distortionary taxes. It's labor and capital taxes that are distortionary. Property taxes are not. That's fairly well proven now, right? So labor and capital. So the more you actually shift tax incidence to property, right, and therefore reduce the labor and capital taxes, the more likely you're going to make your economy more efficient. And happy to discuss that. I agree with the idea of reducing tax expenditures, totally. I think that's very important. But on state-owned enterprises, one basic requirement on state-owned enterprises is just to make sure that they're not a drain on the treasury, right? If they can just meet their costs and their obligations, that's already a win. The problem is that not only are they not paying taxes or dividends, they're actually being subsidized from treasury from taxes. So that's the thing we need to eliminate. And then, I don't really know a lot about carbon taxes. I don't have a lot of hope, right now. I think African countries just need to preserve their natural capital, because it is actually an important heritage that we should preserve, but not worry too much. I don't think that there's going to be international markets that, finance that's going to flow into Africa because of that. At least not in the immediate future anyway. I don't personally think that is in the works. Let me stop here.
Very quickly on 2 points. I think given that the name of the symposium is Bold Moves Amid the Global Shifts, I think that this trade-off between trading under the FCFTA or not trading under the FCFTA will need a bold move, in the sense that I think so far that most of the African countries, especially that are part of regional economic communities that are working relatively well, definitely the opportunity cost of trading under the FCFTA is higher. So it will need a kind of political will and a bold move to say that let's submit the trade exchange guide of all the countries and trade within the FCFTA. Without this, it will lead to a kind of time inconsistency, in the sense that we would still stick in the short term to the REX without trading under the FCFTA. On the point of capital markets, I totally agree with Andrew on the fact that if micro, small and medium firms are not part of larger clusters with FDI in the manufacturing sector and in new sectors that are different from the construction sector, the textile sector, or the natural resources in general, this will lead to the same problem that we currently have, in the sense that we will still have FDI that does not generate jobs, that does not lead to technology transfer, that does not lead to export upgrading, and that does not create externalities with small and medium firms. So that's why, from my perspective, the key would be to change this, because so far we have between 60 and 70% of FDI in African countries that go to those sectors with a limited value added. So if this does not change, I don't think that SMEs will be able to integrate into domestic and global value chains and to be integrated also in the capital markets. Thank you.
Ferry, please.
Okay, thank you. I mean, the clock here has gone red, which means no time. So I really don't have much to add on some of the responses given, but a couple of points on the fiscal policy. You say the governance issue. I agree, governance issue, but I think it's also a policy issue. Let me give you an example. Many African countries are busy giving FDI tax incentives, for example. But the evidence shows that actually the priority for many of these foreign investors is not tax incentive. They would rather have a better environment for investment, less regulations, and more sort of attractive environment rather than giving 10-year tax incentives and so on. So all these are resources that governments would have collected. Resource rent, actually, Andrew mentioned it, is one of the lowest in Africa. So really, it's a policy priority, policy issue as well. On growth, really, the thing about growth, Andrew, is that in African countries in particular, one thing that we have learned over the years is that there is growth, there is also growth. We keep seeing countries registering 7%, 6%, 8% growth consistently without really showing much progress development, and there are also countries growing less than that, which showing a lot of progress. So really, what is driving the growth matters very much. Whether the growth is driven by sectors that create jobs, sectors that create income, areas that generate export, then of course the benefits of growth will be higher, income will be higher, there will be savings, and countries can borrow and pay. But if growth is being registered in low productivity and in low value, labor-intensive activities, like services, for example, services are higher in Africa, about 47% on average, African countries. But in terms of export of services globally, Africa registers, less than 2%, in fact, 1-point-something%, which means that a lot of the services are non-tradable, low-value activities that do not generate much income. So growth is very important, but what's driving growth matters even more. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you. J'avais préparé, lorsque je préparais la session, 6 questions.
Thank you. When I prepared this session, I prepared 6 questions. If there weren't enough questions, I know I left at least 4 hands for whom I won't give the floor. I'm sorry, you see how interesting it is.
For the symposium. Thank you very much. Have a nice night. Thank you.